Good evening, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Hello. So we just have a few minutes before we start, so I just want to make sure if there's empty seats near you, if you can raise your hand, that way whoever's standing can have a seat. It seems that we have a lot of availability. So if anyone wants to sit down that is standing, okay, perfect. Thank you all so much for coming. And we'll be beginning in a few minutes. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Scobee Education Center. I'm glad that all of you can make it this evening. I know it's very cold for South Texas, and so I do appreciate you all making the effort, the extra effort to come here. Tonight we are collaborating with TPR for their Think Science presentation. And so I will have Nathan from TPR, Texas Public Radio, go ahead and do the introduction to our special guest of the evening.
I'm going to start the tape rolling because we're recording tonight as well for our website later on. Welcome to Think Science. I'm Nathan Cohn with Texas Public Radio. At each of our quarterly Think Science panel talks and discussions, our goal is to bring you in and out in an hour, having learned a little bit more about the subject at hand. And tonight, you're in for an inspiring and exciting hour as we hear from a pioneer in aviation and space. As I mentioned, we're recording tonight's program, and the audio will be posted online next week so that you can share it with a friend or maybe your children, grandchildren, or any other young person in your life, because there's likely to be something to inspire the next generation in tonight's talk. This is our first in-person Think Science event since the beginning of the pandemic. And I want to thank I want to thank you all for being here, for doing your part over these 2 years to keep yourself and your neighbors safe. And I want to thank San Antonio College and the Scobee Education Center for being stellar co-presenters with Texas Public Radio. This is such a beautiful facility. I feel inspired just walking in the door here. It's great. And finally, this Think Science presentation is made possible by San Antonio Kidney, San Antonio Vascular and Endovascular Clinic, Port San Antonio, and the Edwards Aquifer Authority. Some of our friends from these organizations are at the tables lining the walls back over there, so if you haven't had a chance to visit with them, please avail yourself to that. Eileen Collins was an aviation pioneer her entire career, from her crowning achievements as the first woman to command an American space mission, as well as the first to pilot the space shuttle, to her early years as one of the Air Force's first female pilots. She was in the first class of women to earn pilot's wings at Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma, and their first female instructor pilot. She was only the second woman pilot admitted to the Air Force's elite test pilot program at Edwards Air Force Base. NASA had such confidence in her skills as a leader and pilot that she was entrusted to command the first shuttle mission after the Columbia disaster, returning the United States to space flight after a 2-year hiatus. The book that you see on the table behind us over here, Through the Glass Ceiling to the Stars, is the first time that Eileen Collins has told her story in a book. It's a story not only of achievement and overcoming obstacles, but of profound personal transformation as well. And most importantly, this book and Collins' life story is an inspiration to the next generation of young scientists, pilots, and astronauts. Her list of achievements continues to grow to this day. If I am correct, in April, you're going to be the Battle of Flowers Grand Marshal, is that correct? So the list of achievements grows. Fiesta royalty as well. Let's welcome Colonel Eileen Collins to the podium.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Nathan, and thank you, Roxanne, and thank you, Scobee Education Center, for all the great things that you do. And in the audience, well, we have such a large group here tonight. Thank you for coming. And I'm going to I have my 3 main points that I was going to talk about tonight, and then we'll open up for questions. So as we go through, think about any questions you might have, and I will answer anything that your heart desires. The 3 things I wanted to talk about tonight: first of all, why I wrote the book; secondly, what astronauts do; and finally, the future of space. And I think there's probably some young people in the audience that may want to work in the space program someday. So why did I write a book? I never set out to write a book. I'm an operator, I am a pilot, I'm an astronaut, I like to do things, and never planned on writing a book. But after I retired, the years went by, people would ask me, why don't you write a book? I go, I don't have time. And then I had a acquaintance of mine named Jonathan Ward that contacted me and said, let's write a book together. And this was before the pandemic. And I said, thank you, Jonathan, I'm flattered, but no, I don't have time. I don't want to write a book. Well, then the pandemic hit. And being a speaker that I am, and being on various boards and advisory groups, I travel a lot. Well, all my travel canceled. And I was sitting at home and the country was shut down. I'm kind of working on my schedule and really not doing anything. I called Jonathan. I said, let's write the book. So it happened because of the pandemic, and at least in my life, something good came out of the pandemic. And I think that the reason that really set me over the final decision was the fact that I thought that I had a story to tell that would help inspire young people. So the number 1 reason I wrote the book was to inspire young people to consider careers in STEM fields: science, technology, engineering, and math, in space, and also in the military, because I began my career in the Air Force. And I also think that nowadays, not as many young people, there's no draft anymore, and we're an all-volunteer military, and a lot of young people really don't know anything about the military. And I had a wonderful Air Force career. I loved every single day of it. And my husband who's here tonight, Pat Youngs, he was also a pilot in the Air Force, and put up with all my crazy flying. And it was just, I have nothing but wonderful things to say about my time in the Air Force. So I wanted to get that documented in the book for young people to read. The other thing was to inspire, not only inform them, but to inspire them. So sometimes we don't have a lot of confidence in ourselves, and I was that kind of person. When I was young, I was very shy. In fact, I stuttered, and here I am speaking in front of people, but I would stutter because I was very shy. And I was not really good at a whole lot of anything when I was in elementary, middle school, and even high school. I wasn't good at sports. You know, we used to pick teams, and myself and another girl were always the last two that were picked. And my grades were kind of B, and you know, I was kind of a B student, and I was kind of going through school. And I didn't really have a lot of confidence in myself. And, you know, so what am I gonna do with my life? I got into high school, and when I graduated from high school, I remember seeing my high school classmates going across the stage, and they were getting scholarships, and they were like graduating like in the top 10%. And I'm going, oh, you know, did I waste my high school years? Maybe I should have applied myself a little bit more. So I went to community college, 2 years at upstate New York, Corning Community College, and I buckled down. I took math and science. I worked very hard. My goal was to get straight A's, which I never did, but I did much better than I had ever done in high school. And I realized, hey, maybe if I try a little bit harder and I work and apply myself, I might actually be able to do something good. So I think I really, at that point in my life, I was 20 years old, I decided to take flying lessons. So how did the flying, where'd that come from? You know, I thought you had to kind of be a good athlete to fly, but let's back up a little bit. So how did I get interested in flying? Mostly through books. So I was kind of a bookworm. My mother would always take us to the library, and some of the books I remember reading were Fate is the Hunter. It's a book by Ernest Gahn about exploring the world in an airplane. I read God is My Co-Pilot, which is a book about a military pilot. And I read The Stars at Noon, which is a book about one of the first women Air Force service pilots, how they got started. And I learned that I was really inspired by flying by reading books. So I still encourage young people today to read books. It's kind of hard nowadays to put your phone down because there's so much going on there, but it's nice to like cuddle up in the corner with a book and kind of let your imagination run wild. The other thing I think that inspired me was my parents. Now, my parents had a lot of problems, so they were not perfect parents, but I still remember the things that they said to me. So my dad would get mad at me because I was not being a leader, and he wanted me to be a leader. So he would always yell at me for following my friends around, and you know, he would say, you know, stop being a follower, but you know, have a mind of your own. But he was very colorful, and he would actually say things like, if all your friends jumped off the Walnut Street Bridge into the water, would you jump off the Walnut Street Bridge into the water? And I still remember this because it irritated me so much, but he was right. And you know, he would tell me, be a leader, have a mind of your own. And I think that's why I ended up going off and flying when no other women my age were flying. And then my mother would say to me, as a child, she'd say to me, there's no one else in the world exactly like you. Every single person is an individual with their own talents and their own skills. And I still remember that. She was right. So we don't all want to go out and do the same thing and follow everybody else. Group think, follow the crowd. No, we want to think for ourselves and decide to do the right thing for us. So I decided I was 20 years old, I'm going to go fly. Well, I'm really nervous about this. I had saved up all my money from part-time jobs. I had the money. My parents didn't even know this. They had no money to send me off to flying lessons, but I had saved up $1,000. And I was very nervous, but I called the local airport and I said, hey, do you teach people how to fly? Because they had phone books back in those days, right? There were no internet. I'm in the phone book. And they're like, oh yeah, come on up. So I drove up there in my little Datsun B210 car, and they're like, come on in, and here's the Cessna 150, and we have Cherokee 140s, and there's our simulator. And I'm like, man, maybe I can do this. So I started flying, and I found out I was good at it. and they let me go solo. And I thought maybe I could apply to the Air Force. And my timing was such that the Air Force had just started taking women into pilot training. It was 1978, it was a test program. And they had already sent a couple classes. The Air Force had taken a couple, I think they had a group of 10 women and then a group of, they went through and then they had a group of 6 women. And I was in, I believe I was in the 3rd group, I might've been in the 4th, but I was the 1st group right out of college. And they sent us to Vance Air Force Base in Enid, Oklahoma, 4 women, first women to ever go through pilot training at that base. And there were 40 pilots in the class. And there were over 500 pilots on the base. And so I'm going to kind of jump ahead here a little bit into my Air Force career. So not only were the 4 of us women trying to be the best pilot we could be so we could get our Air Force wings and go fly, but we had to do well so the Air Force would approve, would say the women passed the program, and now we can let women, it's not a test program anymore, but now women can go in the program as regular pilots just like the guys. So we had to pass the program, and I think they put through about 6 or 7 classes, and the Air Force declared, yep, women can fly airplanes. In fact, they'll fly just like the guys. They're not any better, they're not any worse. They're just like the guys. And so women were allowed to fly in the Air Force back in those days. And it's one of the things I'm very proud of, is being part of the first group of women to do that. So one other thing that happened while I was at Vance Air Force Base, in my training class, that same year, NASA selected their first group of Space Shuttle astronauts. And in that class of 35, they called themselves the 35 new guys, the TFNGs. They had 6 women, and those women were mission specialists. And they came to my base at Vance. I actually didn't get to talk to any of them, but they came to the base and they did their parachute training. And everybody's like, oh, the women astronauts are over there. And I remember thinking, well, maybe I could do that someday. So that's a little bit of the history about how women got involved in the military, how the women got involved in the space shuttle program. And I just happened to be at that point in time where I was able to be part of that group. And that was very, very rewarding. And so my Air Force career was very rewarding. I went on to fly C-141s. I flew around the world, and I applied to the Air Force Test Pilot School, and it was the most difficult year of my life, by the way. There's a chapter in the book on Test Pilot School, and actually when I wrote the chapter, I wrote all the pranks that the students played on each other. And then we had to cut back on the pranks because we thought that maybe people might read the book and say, what do they do at that test pilots? Maybe we ought to defund that place because all they're doing is playing games. And you know, one of the, I could give you lots of examples, but one of them is we used to roof stomp each other's homes. And I was the class leader because I was a senior ranking officer. I was the class leader. I had a party at my house one night, and I invited it was the first weekend we were there, invited the class over, and the senior class came in, they got on the top of these are 1-story houses that are flat in the desert, just flat roofs. And they jumped up and down on top of our roof like it was an earthquake. And so we're like, okay. So we had to get even with them. So a couple weeks later, we went on their roofs and we unplugged their air conditioners. And it was July. And so that kind of stuff was going back and forth. And so I had to cut down. I have some of that in the book, but I mostly talk about what test pilots do. It is an extremely difficult year with writing papers and giving presentations about the work that you're doing, but most of all, you're flying airplanes, and I flew 30 different types of aircraft that year. So it was very, very challenging because you have to study each aircraft, the boldface, the emergency procedures. But it was while I was at Edwards that I applied to the astronaut program. And I was fortunate to get selected. I'm happy to answer, I would love to talk more, we don't have time, but I would love to talk more about astronaut selection and astronaut training. So please ask those questions if you'd like. But I do want to talk about what astronauts do, not just what I did, but what the space shuttle astronauts do, and then what's different now that we have the space station and the Artemis program. But back when I was an astronaut, we did basically 4 things. The first was to fly, and the pilots and the commanders flew the space shuttle. I mean, we hand flew the space shuttle on rendezvous and docking. We did that on orbital maneuvers. We did it on approach and landing. We hand flew it like an airplane. And the pilots also operated the systems. You know, you'd throw switches, run procedures, you know, you'd take care of the hydraulics, the electrical system, the propulsion systems, you know, the on-orbit rendezvous systems. So there was quite a bit of studying and learning, but that was the first thing. You fly and you operate like an airplane. The second thing is robotics. So the space shuttle had, and now the space station has robot arms. So the astronauts use laptop computers and cameras to operate the robot arm, and you can't always see it. In fact, on the space station, you almost never see it. You just move the cameras around and you run the procedures and you operate the arm, but you need to be able to kind of visualize what's going on. So the robotics activity is actually quite difficult. In fact, one astronaut described it as like flying a helicopter. So there's a lot of training that needs to take place in robotics. People might think it's easy, but it's not. The third is spacewalks. So the astronauts go outside, and I know that next week there's going to be a spacewalk on the space station. What are they doing? They change out the solar arrays, they change out components that operate the space station, they put experiments on the outside. Sometimes they add like little docking rings for future spacecraft, and that is a lot of training takes place in the pool at Johnson Space Center. And then the fourth thing is the experiments. So this is getting to be more and more important, and it's really part of the reason of why we're there in the first place, to do the experiments. So the space station, the whole purpose of the space station, which by the way is still up there and operating, it was first launched, the first component in the year 2000, and it was fully complete in 2011, and now it's 2022. The space station is still operating. It has had astronauts up there permanently for over 21 years now. And the astronauts volunteer themselves as experiments. So you know, sometimes take blood, you take samples. The scientists want to see like how does the human body adapt to space. They study your eyes and your ears and your bones, and pretty much what changes in the human body when you're up there in zero gravity. It teaches us a lot about back here on Earth. Also, we do medical research. We do technology development. Probably one of the biggest ones is the solar arrays on the space station. By the way, the space station is completely powered by solar, by the sun. And we are studying how to convert carbon dioxide back into oxygen, because you're enclosed up there, right? And so humans breathe out carbon dioxide and you breathe in oxygen. Well, since we don't have a lot of plants to do, you could never fit enough plants in there to convert the CO2 back to oxygen. We have different types of equipment. We have to have that to keep the station operating, but the other benefit there is all of this equipment that we will someday be using on the moon and Mars has to work on the space station, because you don't want it to be on the moon or on Mars and that equipment is breaking down. And we're still having problems with that equipment on the space station. And we need engineers to help us design better equipment that's going to be more reliable in the long run. So all of those are just a couple examples of the technology development. And the other things that are going up on the space station is Earth observation, looking back and seeing how the Earth is changing. We have cameras that are programmed to automatically take photographs, but the astronauts can look out. The automatic ones go down nadir, looking straight down at the Earth. But the astronauts can look out the window and see the horizon and see a more oblique view and take photos. Maybe, oh, there's a forest fire. Oh, there's a volcano going off. Oh, something looks unusual that I have never seen before in my Earth observation classes. And they can alert the scientists and take these photos. And sometimes astronauts might be the first ones to alert the scientists that, hey, a volcano erupted in a certain area, or there's a fire burning in a certain area. So that Earth observation is very important. So those are some of the things that are taking place on the space station. And finally, the whole reason we have a space station is a test bed to how to keep people alive and safe for deep space missions, which is what NASA plans to do next, which is going back to the moon and going on to Mars. And that is NASA's strategy right now for human spaceflight. So this takes us into the future of space. So I think of, I'm going to kind of jump off to a little different topic. I think of space in 3 different ways. So you might ask yourself, where is space? And I'm not sure if we ever really answer that question. You know, where is space? Well, you got the Earth, and space is everywhere else, right? Well, the breathable air only goes up about 2 to 3 miles. Airplanes fly at about 6 or 7 miles, commercial airplanes. If you go up to 50 miles, technically you can have astronaut wings. You become, if you're an Air Force pilot and you go over 50 miles, you can put the astronaut wings on your pilot wings. So that applied way back in the 60s when the Air Force was flying the X-15, and those test pilots would go up to 50 miles in the X-15 and they would get astronaut wings. 50 miles is pretty close. I mean, if you could drive, let's say from here to Austin, now Austin might be 60 miles. That's not that far. I mean, you can drive there in maybe an hour and 15 minutes. And if you take that distance horizontal and took it and go vertical, that's how, I mean, you could probably drive, if you could drive straight there, you could get there in an hour, 15 minutes. But if you think back to Alan Shepard flew in 1961. He flew a suborbital flight out of Kennedy Space Center. So he flew up to 50, 60 miles, came right back down and splashed down. He did not go around the Earth, but he went into space and he was an astronaut. That's called suborbital. And then Gus Grissom did the same thing. And then the following year, John Glenn went into orbit. So to go into orbit, you need to at least go to 100 miles, roughly. 90, 190. You need to go about, you have to have enough escape velocity to get away from the Earth. You go around the Earth, it's about 90 minutes to get around the Earth at 100 miles. That's in orbit. So John Glenn went into orbit. So think back to the Blue Origin flights that happened over the past year. You might remember like William Shatner flew and Jeff Bezos flew, Michael Strahan flew. All of those flights on Blue Origin were suborbital. They launched out of New Mexico, they went up to about 50, 55 miles, and they came right back down, and they landed near their launch site. Honestly, that was like a 12-minute flight. So those are suborbital. Now, there is a company, a commercial company that is going to orbit, and that's SpaceX. So SpaceX goes to orbit, but they also take our astronauts to the space station. So as I mentioned, orbit, you gotta be 100 miles. One of these days I'll get a slide for this, but it's hard to do that because the scale is so, you'll see the scale is kind of tough to put it on a slide. But SpaceX goes to orbit. So the space station is in orbit. It's at 200 to 220 miles. Goes around the Earth once every 90 minutes. SpaceX has figured out how to, they're commercial. They built it themselves. Their Falcon 9 rocket and their Dragon capsule takes our astronauts to orbit, docks with the space station, and we do our crew exchanges, and they also take cargo for us. So what else is different from suborbital and orbital? The big difference is if you go to orbit, you have to have a heat shield when you come back. Because whereas the suborbital goes up, comes down, they don't heat up. They do get a good G load. I mean, they'll get a good 4 to 5 G load coming back, but they don't get hot. They don't get real hot. As you do when you come back from orbit. So SpaceX, like the space shuttle, go to orbit. When you come back, you are very hot. You're going 25 times the speed of sound. You're coming really from over the Indian Ocean trying to land at Kennedy Space Center. It's about almost an hour to return, and you'll heat up, at least on the shuttle, we heated up to almost 3,000 degrees on the outside. So we had to have tiles, we had to have what we call reinforced carbon-carbon heat shield to keep us from burning up. So that's the big difference. Now, the third thing is deep space. So I say that's the third place. So that is most of the rest of space. So the moon, I would say deep space, the moon would be 1,000 times farther away than the space station. So the moon's about 200, 220,000 miles. It takes 3 days to get to the moon. I mean, how long does it take to get to space station? Maybe, I mean, if you could fly right at it, you'd get there in 15 minutes, but we take longer. But the moon's about 3 days away. Mars is 6 months away, if the planets are on the same side of the sun. If the planets are on opposite sides of the sun, it's 2 years. So Mars is so much farther away that if we're going to send astronauts there someday, the equipment has to work. If it doesn't, they're going to die. So that's what we're doing on space station, is checking out this equipment. And then the life support, the power, we're going to put a base on the moon and test the equipment there. The whole reason we're going back to the moon is to test the equipment, is a build-up approach before we go to Mars. So finally, on the deep space side, NASA is going to deep space. NASA's turning over low Earth orbit to the commercial folks, Spacex, whoever else wants to go there, Sierra Nevada, Blue Origin, Boeing. There's a lot of private companies that will be building space stations and ways to get there in low Earth orbit. So NASA will maybe pay them to kind of be a customer, but for the most part, for the exploration, NASA's going to deep space, and it's called the Artemis Program. On March 17th, which is next week, they're going to roll out Artemis 1. It'll roll out to the pad, they're going to do some testing on it, but it will launch in May. It will be with no astronauts on board, but it will launch to the moon, it'll circle the moon and come back, test flight. A year later, they're going to launch Artemis 2, which will have astronauts on board. I'm not sure if it's 3 or 4, but they will have a crew. They will fly to the moon, they'll circle the moon, and they'll come back, splash down. Artemis 3 will land on the moon. Now that will be 2025. It's going to be, I wouldn't predict when it's going to happen because they still don't have the lander built yet. But astronauts will land on the moon. And then they have Artemis 4, 5, and 6. So NASA will go to deep space. And why is NASA doing this? Well, the government usually goes first to prove to the rest of the private industry, hey, it can be done. We kind of control the risks, and then we hope private industry will follow. And you will see more and more civilians and paying customers flying into space. And we all think that's a good thing. So that's pretty much the future of space. And I think, I talked about human space flight, but there's a lot going on in robotics with rovers on the moon and Mars, and there's other countries doing that. We have the James Webb Space Telescope that's launched, and so far so good. And we'll start sending pictures back this summer. And there's so many other exciting things that people can choose as their career in space. The astronauts tend to be the most visible, but we're not. We are just part of this great big team that we all work together on the exploration of space. So that's pretty much just kind of in a nutshell a little bit, and I talk about that in the book. Mostly I talk about my missions and the crazy things that happen on my missions. And if you're interested in like some of the things that happen in the Shuttle program, I hope you enjoy that part. So I am going to turn it over for questions here and see what Nathan or what anybody in the audience, and I will answer any question you have. So
Absolutely.
Don't be shy.
Absolutely. So if I may start off with one question, then also let you know that when it comes time for you to ask a question, I'll bring the microphone to you so that everybody can hear your question, all right? And it'll be picked up here. First thing I wanted to ask, though, you alluded to this a moment ago when you were talking about SpaceX and Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic. In terms of careers for people wanting to go into space, is it really different now because of these commercial enterprises, now that NASA is really not the only game in town, so to speak?
Right, so NASA is not the only game in town, that's for sure. There are many more space jobs outside of NASA, just the pure quantity of them. But I would say, there's two different answers to your question. If I wanted to be an astronaut today, let's go with a NASA astronaut first. If I wanted to be a NASA astronaut, I would get a degree in engineering, because I think as a former shuttle commander, who do I want on my crew? I want astronauts that can fix things when they're broken, and I want astronauts that can solve problems, because nothing ever goes according to plan. And I think that if you're an engineer or even a scientist, you are taught how to solve problems. And there's actually methods for that. I mean, and you practice that as you're working on your degree. So frankly, any engineering degree at all, I think is important. Now, the other degree is geology, because we are going to the moon and we're going to Mars, and we're gonna need people that can do like field geology. And back in the Apollo program, there was a big question: should we hire test pilots and teach them to be geologists, or should we hire geologists and teach them to be pilots? And so they mostly did the first, but there was one geologist, Jack Schmidt, who was a professional geologist, and NASA taught him how to fly an airplane, and he became the lunar module pilot. So, and then the other part of your question was on the commercial. Yes. So that is going to be so much more wide open. I think right now, commercial, you just have to have money. That's for rich people. And, you know, unless you can get picked by a rich person to go for free, and I don't know how you do that. I mean, Wally Funk was able, so you need to be rich right now, but as more flying takes place, as more people fly, and we like it when the rich people fly because they are taking the risk, they're going out there, they're testing the spacecraft. Yeah, and there is risk, it's gutsy to do that. We get more experience and we become safer and the cost comes down. So eventually, you know, in 50 years, I think an average citizen will be able to fly, as long as we don't have anything unusual happen.
Question right here.
Okay, I didn't hear your opinion.
The first question is, what is your opinion on space ice cream? And the second question. So first, space ice cream, thumbs up or thumbs down. And the second, what kind of training did you do in the Air Force? What was the funniest prank, if you could tell us one thing?
Oh yeah, I'd have to think about that for, well, on the ice cream one, okay, the astronaut ice cream that they sell, I don't really care for it, the freeze-dried stuff, because I just don't know what to say about that, other than, I do want to tell you, okay, so this might answer the second question about, I don't know if it's really a prank, but it's something really funny that happened, and it has to do with ice cream. So my second flight, I flew Shuttle Atlantis, and we went to the Mir space station, which is the Russian space station, which had been up there forever. And the plan was to dock, and we had a joint program and drop off do an astronaut exchange. So we had a freezer, and it was empty. And the purpose of the freezer was to put the samples from the experiments off of Mir, put them in the freezer, bring them home. They had to stay frozen. So it's about a week before launch, and the scientists go, hey, y'all want some ice cream in that freezer? And my commander, Charlie Precourt, is like, yeah, we'll take some ice cream. And they go, well, you know, you have to eat it because you can't bring it back because we need all the space in the freezer for the samples. So like, okay, well, just, you know, 7 of us. Well, they loaded up that freezer with those, you know, the wooden spoons and those little dishes. There were like 100 of them in there. And when you go up in space, you don't really want to eat sugary stuff because you mostly want salty foods because your body, you're not burning a lot of energy. And you're also getting dehydrated. So because you're not burning energy, you don't want sugar, but because you're dehydrated, you want salt. So nobody wanted to eat the ice cream. And our commander, right to the end of the mission, he goes, you all need to eat that ice cream because we can't throw it away. There's no garbage can. I mean, it would melt, obviously, if you put it in the garbage, and you can't do that. And nobody wanted to eat it. So he said, I order you to eat that ice cream. You have to eat it. So we went over to the Russians, Vasily Sableyev and Sasha Lazukin. Hey, do you guys want some ice cream? They ate all of it. And they had been up in space for months, and they were just dying. So that was my funny ice cream story.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to hear a lot. My question to you is, do you offer some advice for somebody starting their aviation journey a little later in life than what you did?
Yeah, aviation journey starting later in life. So when I went up to the Elmira Corning Airport to ask for flying lessons at age 20, there was a woman who was probably 45 years old. She told me how old she was, and she was learning how to fly for the first time, and she did great. And I thought, well, it took a lot more guts for her to do that than for me, a young person thinking, I might want to be, a professional pilot someday. She just wanted to fly for fun. And we got to be really good friends on that. But I'm a member of Women in Aviation, which is an international group of women pilots. And then there's also the 99s, which is women pilots started by Amelia Earhart. I'm a member of them also. And those are organizations, and men can be members too. But they were started to help getting women interested in flying. They go way back. So I think being a member of one of those organizations, they have scholarships and they have the, I want to say, camaraderie, and you have like a culture. They do fun stuff. They paint runways, and so I would get involved in one of those organizations. But flying is expensive, and as gas prices go up, it just gets more and more expensive. So you have to save money. I had to save up money to learn how to fly. Hopefully that'll help. But it's good to have a network. That was the word I was looking for, network.
In the back.
I have a couple of questions. The first one is, what was your biggest hurdle breaking through that class meeting? The second one is, when you were breaking through it, did you realize it at that moment?
Well, so probably the biggest hurdle was myself, because as I mentioned earlier, I grew up kind of shy, and sometimes I didn't always have the most confidence in myself, and I would have doubts as I went through my career. So I think the way I got over that is I tried to stay very mission focused. Like as you go through life, you define a mission. What do I want to do? I want to get my FAA private license, or I want to be accepted into military pilot training. Like you make a goal for yourself, and you just stay focused on that. And then when you hit the roadblocks, you look for problem solving. You look for ways around it. So I would say the hardest thing was really believing in myself. And it didn't happen every day. It was more of a long-term thing. And then what was the second one? It was going through the yeah. So when I was working at NASA, I felt like every day I was working with the guy. I didn't feel different as a woman, because we're all team members, and no one ever treated me differently. I loved working at NASA because the men and the women, nobody cares what you look like. It's all, you walk in the room, it's like, what's the mission? What are we doing here? What's the purpose of this meeting? You're extremely mission focused. So I never felt different within NASA. But when I went to talk with the news people, oh boy, that was, I think, to answer your question, that's when I realized, because there would be like 10 times more of them would come to our press conference because they want, what's the woman like? And they did that also when Mae Jemison, who was the first Black woman, Mamoru Mari was the first Japanese. I mean, the press would be there. And that's when you realize, yeah, it's different. So, okay.
How many years of training did it take to become an instructor?
So how many years of training? Well, it's actually, once you get selected, it's 1 year, okay, of actual training is while you are professionally working for NASA. And after that 1 year, I think now it's almost 2 years, because we have the space station, which takes longer. So it's, let me say 1 to 2 years of very specific astronaut training to you get a silver pin that says you graduated from training. And then when you're flying space, you get a gold pin. But the other part of your question, you actually start training when you're in kindergarten, because on my first mission, I'm there with the scissors and the tape and the paper and the coloring pens, and I was doing that stuff. And I remember saying, I sure am glad I went to kindergarten, because I'm using all of those skills up here in space. And so I think everything you learn in school from the time you start all the way up to when you start training, all of that applies. It's like all of your life skills come together. Thanks for the question.
What is the number one advice you give to a 10-year-old who's wanting to be an astronaut?
Okay, so for a 10-year-old wanting to be an astronaut, number one advice, pay attention in school. Do your homework and read books. So that's kind of 3 things, but they're really, put them all together. And I think, I'm going to talk about reading books, because reading books will help your imagination. And because as you read, your imagination will picture what something looks like. And it helps develop your creativity. And I think that it's really important for many other parts of, just life development and learning. When I was your age, I read about the future, I read science fiction. Now that I'm older, I read about the past. I like to read about history. But I think that school, all of it's important. So, great question.
Was there any moments in training where you felt scared?
Oh, did I feel it train? Yes. We had some really interesting things happen in the airplane. So astronauts fly T-38s. I was never, by the way, let me back up. I was never afraid, like in the simulator or in the classroom, or if we were doing like tabletop robotics, that was all very safe. But we fly T-38s, and the reason we have real jets and we fly in the real air traffic control system, we do acrobatics, we do instruments, we do formation flying, is because we have to get in the real world and train. And when you do that, you're exposed to weather, you're exposed to airplanes breaking down, and you're exposed to certain risks that, if you follow the rules, you're going to be okay. Sometimes when people break the rules, that can be unsafe. So I have had, in my book, I talk about one incident where I went into a thunderstorm. And I won't go through that whole story now, but I ended up in a thunderstorm because I asked air traffic control, I said, I see a thunderstorm, can I get a vector to the north? No. Can I get a vector to the south? No. Can I climb? Can I descend? They wouldn't let me go anywhere. And I ended up in the thunderstorm. And that was very scary because we were like bouncing all over the place and getting hit by hail. We didn't get hit by lightning, but we got hit by hail. And I learned after that I should have declared an emergency. And when you declare an emergency, they have to give you a vector somewhere. And I was very young, I was a new pilot, and I think I learned, so that's one of the mistakes I talk about in my book, but that was probably one of the scary things that happened in training, in flight training. Not really afraid in space, that was pretty safe. Yes.
This will be the last one before we go to our quote signing portion. We would like to know what the experience was in blasting off.
Oh, I was going to talk about that, but we ran out of time. Okay, you're laying on your back, you strap in about 3 hours before takeoff, you're strapped in and you're running the checklist, and the checklist and the clock controls everything. And you're talking to the launch control center, you're adjusting your gear, you're throwing switches, going through the checklist, and you watch the clock count. So when it goes down below T-minus 31 seconds, the onboard computers take control. You might get a scrub there because instead of the launch control center sending the commands, now the commands are coming out of the onboard computers. So you get over 31 seconds, T-minus 31 seconds, and your heart starts beating. And then you watch the clock, like T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and then T-minus 6, the engines start, and you hear like this rumbling sound, and it feels like it's like an earthquake. It starts shaking underneath you, and it sounds like you're in a room on fire, and the engines come up to speed, and then you watch T-minus 3, 2, 1, and at T-minus 0, the boosters light. And that's like a jolt. And those boosters are those, we call them like white pencils, but they're those white solid rocket motors on the outside. When those light, you can't turn them off, you can't throttle them. Unlike the main engines, they can be shut down. But when those boosters light, you're going, you are not scrubbing. And if they light, you're off the pad, and you just start accelerating like crazy. You're going over 100 miles an hour by the time you clear the top of the launch pad. And all this shaking going on. If you try to write on your checklist, your hand would be going, you'd never be able to read it. Your hand would be going all over the place. So a lot of shaking for 2 minutes while those solid rocket boosters burn. And especially on my first flight, because it was February, we went through the jet stream. And so there's a lot of, the summer flights were smoother, but the winter flights, there's a lot of slamming back and forth going on. The boosters fall off at 2 minutes, and at that point it's a smooth ride, but you're accelerating. So you got this force on you. And the force is 3 Gs. Eventually, it builds up to 3 Gs. And to explain, to explain what that is, round numbers, if you weighed 100 pounds on Earth, round numbers, and you could step on a weight scale for the shuttle launch, it would register 300 pounds because you have that much force on your body, force of acceleration. And then when the other thing is my first 3 launches were at night, so it's like you're in a thunderstorm because all that engine burning is flashing in the window. And then finally, MECO is main engine cutoff. It happens about 8.5 minutes. And all the engines is automatically, they're cut off. to the millisecond. And you don't get thrown forward because there's no braking. You just instantly go to zero gravity. And you're up, at that point, you're like at 90 miles, and everything starts floating. Like your neck ring starts floating, your checklist starts floating, your tethers are floating, and all this dust is in the air. And the sun comes in, and it's surreal. There's all this dust flying around, and then the sound is gone. All that burning sound is gone. It's just quiet, except you hear the of all the fans. You can hear all the fans going. There's cabin fans, av bay fans, experiment fans. And you look out and you're like, whoa. You see the sun coming up. At least my first launch was at midnight, and we're up in space and you can see the sun come up. And my flight engineer says to me, Eileen, stop working, look out the window. It's your first sunrise from space. And I looked out, and the beautiful rainbow you see, you know, the color, it's like blue and yellow and orange, and it's a curve. You're like, wow, the Earth is round. and it is, because, you know, I've flown airplanes my whole life, and you look out front and you see the flat horizon, but now I look out and I see the Earth is round, and I tell people the Earth is not flat, because I saw it with my own eyes. And I went around in 90 minutes. Thank you very much. Those are great questions.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Roxanne for just a second, who will explain how the book signing portion will work this evening. I want to say thank you all so much for being here today. Thanks also to San Antonio Kidney, San Antonio Vascular and Endovascular Clinic, Port San Antonio, and the Edwards Aquifer Authority. Big thank you to our host presenter, San Antonio College and the Scobee Education Center. Our next Think Science discussion for Texas Public Radio is coming up in May. We'll be learning more about the future of the meat industry and alternative meats. And I'm Nathan Cohn. Don't forget to listen to Science Friday every Friday afternoon from 1 to 3 on Texas Public Radio. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon. I'm going to turn the mic over to Roxanne.
Okay, so in your books, you should have gotten a ticket, and I'll have a number. We're going to go in sections just so we don't overcrowd the area.